everyone. Welcome to our series on releasing shame is your superpower. And I want to welcome Michael and Freya Inanna from Inanna Sanctuary.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for joining. So Michael and Freya, I met them about a little over a year ago. I'm looking at the date. It's in May. And I worked with you two about a year ago, actually. Right? Was it a year?
Yes. Yes, it has been.
Yeah, that was after several trainings with other organizations, and I met you both. And we have decided to partner together on this series. We were actually both commenting on abuse from different aspects, making posts about abuse from different aspects. And so I reached out to Michael and Freya because this work is dear to our heart. We work with a lot of clients who have gone through all types of abuse. And so our heart is actually to expose the many aspects of abuse and remove the shame so that people can walk in freedom and healing. So
yeah, I'm going to jump in here and say that Kelly has actually not just been through our retreat program for her own healing and expansion, but she's also been through our practitioner training and what she's doing in the world.
You cut off a little bit there, Freya.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now, but you froze for a minute.
I just wanted to say that Kelly has not only been through our retreat program for her own healing and transformation, but she's been through our practitioner training program, and we're so excited for the transformations that she's creating and the healing she's creating in the world. So
thank you, Freya. Thank you for the shout out. So Michael or Freya, do either one of you want to share about why you're so excited about this series?
Well, we run across shame all the time when working with people. It's probably one of the most fundamental traumas that we store. And also, when we look at our origin stories, Ray and I both, we come from communities where shame is a huge deal. It's heaped on you liberally. It's a way of life. You swim in it. And so we saw the effects it had for us to release that for good and how it changed our lives and freed us. And so, yeah, it's a huge passion of ours to see others go through that release and of the bars and chains of shame.
Anything you want to add to that, Freya?
I would love to add to that in all of the work that we do and in everything that we've witnessed, whether it's on social media or in life and in our clients that we work with, shame is a huge factor, a huge contributing factor to their trauma. And it's actually the most insidious and deeply programmed part of their trauma. And it's what holds them back the most from actually being fully expressed in the world and from tapping into their innate.
You're frozen, Freya.
Yeah, she's piggybacking on her cell phone.
Them held back in expression. So it's actually an essential part of what we do.
Thank you, Freya. You cut out a little bit again, so we missed a lot of what you said. I'm not sure if you want to share it again.
You were talking about how it keeps them from tapping into their innate, and then it cut off.
Their innate power, their internal power, their sexuality, their ability to speak their truth and to be fully expressed in the world. And so it's actually the core essential part of what we do is healing and releasing shame.
Thank you. So we want to first define, thank you both of you for sharing, and my heart in this is very similar to both of you. I came from a very religious background as well, and I had heaps of shame put on top of me in addition to the shame surrounding the pain and the trauma and the abuse that I went through. And it was a terrible slave master and kept me in my pain for even longer than necessary. And so this is why I'm so passionate about removing the veils to shame and just showing that there really is nothing to be ashamed about. So we want to hop in really quick and talk about what exactly is abuse. So abuse shows up in many ways, and really what abuse is just using one's power over another. It's an improper use of one's power over another, or an improper treatment towards another. And so that shows up in a lot of ways. And today we're going to be talking about abuse from a lot of different perspectives. So one that's not touched on a lot is people who have identified abusers or who have been identified as abusers. Then there's also self-abuse, and then there's social abuse. We're going to be going over those three topics today. The first one we want to talk about is actually being somebody who abuses their own power, who lords their power over somebody else. So when we're younger, abuse is like, it's something we're not able generally to escape from. And this is a lot of what Michael, Freya, and I deal with. The clients that come to us are people who have dealt with abuse a lot of times from an early age. And when you spend all of your early years with your personal power taken away from you, imagine how you show up in the world. So for me, we all have stories of this, right? Of our personal power being taken from us. Michael, do you want to share anything? Or Freya, do you want to share anything about that?
Yeah, well, sometimes in the interest of keeping our children safe, we feel that we have to make all their decisions for them, or we feel like, you know, they're immature, they don't know the right decision. And how we cheat them when we do that is we short circuit their learning process on how to make decisions. You know, if we can just let them choose their clothes in the morning. You know, I know Damien loves doing that. He'll ask us, what goes with brown? You know, and he'll pick his clothes, and which for a 6-year-old I think is fantastic. But also when there's a problem where you get to discipline, many times you can tell them, instead of just saying, this is the way it is, I'm laying down the law, which is really definitely a withdrawal of power. You're taking their power. Say, okay, there's some consequences for what's going on here. I'm going to let you choose which consequence. Right? And so it still leaves them in the decision-making process. It leaves them a part of it instead of just feeling completely helpless. These are all important ways. There's a lot of ways that we can include our children in the decision-making process, honor their choices, you know, praise them when they make good choices, look at opportunities for learning when they make poor choices. And instead of just saying there's a right way and a wrong way, and it's a big mystery, but I'm going to tell you when you get it wrong, you know. Anyway, look from a standpoint of raising children, I feel that that's the way we can really contribute to their growth.
Well, so often too with children, the go-to, because what we experienced when we were little is this whole idea of shaming to control the decisions that children then make and their expression, using that shame on you, or making them literally feel inside like they're bad because they're not expressing or making decisions or doing things that in a way that maybe we don't agree with. And this is the thing, is that when we show up that way with our children, they literally take on the belief inside on a subconscious level that because we said shame on you, or we yelled at them, or, you know, made them feel small, in that moment they took on the belief that they are bad, they're inherently bad, that there's something wrong with them, and that
Absolutely.
will stick with them throughout their lifetime until they come to a place of being able to heal that and to create a new belief on a subconscious level, because up here does not shift it.
And I believe it's teaching them on a subconscious level to not ask questions, to not question authority. And this is one of the ways in which abuse gets perpetuated. When a child is not allowed to question authority, when they are not allowed to have free thought and free action and learn from mistakes, they go into adulthood full of fear and self-doubt and self-sabotaging, like a lot of self-sabotaging measures. So it's really important to set our children up for success.
Yeah. I got another example, if I could share one, because I see this a lot, and people don't realize what's going on a lot of times, is tickling. Right?
I hate it.
Tickling a child, and they, you know, they laugh. Okay, they laugh because your nervous system responds that way when it gets stimulated that way, and so it's a tendency for people to think, well, they're laughing, they must like it, or everything's okay, they're laughing, but in between laughing, they're saying, stop, I don't like this, quit it, right? And or even crying sometimes, and we keep doing it, and that is absolutely crossing a boundary, taking away that person's power. And again, with Damien, it's one of the things we taught him is that because it's so tempting to tickle a little kid, they're so cute, they laugh, and we taught him, hey, if you don't like it, you get to tell us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it turns out he doesn't like it. He never likes to be tickled.
And my niece loves it. She begs for it.
Yeah, some kids do. Absolutely. Some kids do, but he does not. And so, but we would not have really discovered that if we hadn't given him the choice. And then he's got a friend that tickles him. And
well, and that choice actually came up because of my experience. And to me, tickling is not fun. I don't enjoy it. And I was literally traumatized as a child by an older half brother who tickled me and then shamed me when I cried. Got very angry. And to this day, if somebody tickles me too much, I go into trauma response. It's like it's well, not so much anymore. I literally own my stuff, and I just tell them no, like stop now. And but it was literally
she does too. She absolutely does. She holds that boundary.
Yeah. So we touched on how if we don't teach children how to hold their boundaries and how to have sovereignty at a young age, that they carry these habits into adulthood. And there are many habits that children can carry into adulthood simply by mirroring back the behaviors and the mannerisms and the habits that have been reflected to them throughout life. And this is something I absolutely love to bring up, and I really want to anchor this home for people. When someone has been raised in abuse for a very long time, we have these things called mirroring neurons in us. And what they do is basically they allow us through imitation of body language and facial expressions and emotions to reflect back to the world what we're learning. So imagine for a second you're a child and you have had your voice taken from you, you've had your autonomy taken from you, your body isn't your own because perhaps you've gone through a lot of abuse. So you have a lifetime of your boundaries being violated, of your body not being your own, of your voice being silenced. How do you think someone like that is going to show up in the world? If we have mirroring neurons and we learn by mirroring what's been shown to us, what is going to be reflected into the world? And I am wanting to bring this up right now to have some compassion for people who show up abusing their power, because at some point in their life, this is what was mirrored to them. This is what was modeled to them. And for most people who grossly misabuse their power, they have gone through terrible abuse, terrible trauma. And so some of the ways that this shows up, some of the ways that abusers show up in the world because of what's happened to them is control and manipulation. Did Freya? Oh, there's Freya. You switched on the screen. Michael or Freya, do either one of you want to share stories on control or manipulation? I have stories to share as well, but I love hearing from both of you. You have a wealth of information.
Well, I can share the ways that I used to control. And when I was not really very aware of how I was showing up in the world. And there's a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different techniques. One we've been talking a lot of recently is one of them is to create fear. And we see a lot of that where people create fear around a topic and then it, kind of spirals from there. But in my case, I talk about this in one of my articles, was sort of the nice guy syndrome. Okay, and I talk about how we sort of have in our society, we have this artificially constructed spectrum of nice guy, bad boy, right? And that's sort of what we say is women have to choose from, or men have to choose from in order to be. You can be the bad boy and take what's yours, or take what you want, and you be the nice guy and kind of get walked all over. The truth is, nice guys are just as nasty as your worst bad boy. Nice guys have a belief that when they're nice, they're entitled. If they've been nice, they deserve a particular response. They deserve to be treated a particular way. And they can use this in very manipulative ways. I have used this in manipulative ways, and it doesn't mean that always being nice is always manipulative. Sometimes being nice is just being nice. But when the entitlement steps in, and I would be in a relationship and feel that I deserved certain things because I was a nice guy, it sets the relationship up in a way that is very transactional.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got X nice guy credits. I'm going to withdraw them now and expect this particular thing. And to a partner, that feels like a demand, right? They signed on, they're with you, and they like the nice guy aspect of you, but they don't like it when you use it to try to coerce them into doing something or to make demands. And it's a tricky thing. It's a subtle thing, and it's not ever really acknowledged much in our society, but it's a real thing.
Yeah, it's almost like using your love as a manipulation tactic to get the response that you want. Yeah,
I'm so loving, now pay me.
Yeah.
And it's a lot like a woman who uses her sexuality in a transactional way.
Yeah.
And I put it out. Now pay me.
We see that a lot of times, like the repeating thing is you got the nice guy who shows up for the woman, then they do this and they do that and they do that and they do that. And it's like, oh my God, now you owe me sex.
And how many times have women felt guilted into giving something because somebody was a nice guy?
Yeah. Yeah. And how sustainable is that? How much respect is a man going to command when he's coming from that space, right?
Yeah.
And so then he's got this idea, well, I guess I have to just be the asshole then, because that's what other people they've seen, how they show up, and they get what they want. And so they might lean towards an abuse. It's also an abuse. You're trying to manipulate, you're abusing. Just because it's more obvious and more, huh?
Yeah. It's just whether the abuse is overt or covert.
Yes.
Like whether it's disguised or it's just outright abuse. So
yeah.
And this is the way we've been socialized to behave, when actually there's an entirely different way that's not on that spectrum, which is actually about creating that safety and connection in a relationship that allows us to build the trust and the connection and the desire between two people, so that it's a beautiful synergistic connection that both people are giving and receiving in, rather than feeling coerced or feeling like it's transactional, or feeling like you got to give it up or whatever.
Yeah, and the key, the commonality between those two, yeah, it's a spectrum. It's a spectrum of abuse. Either way, it's abusive, it's manipulative, it's controlling. And that is the commonality. And the actual spectrum is one where you shift from control, from power over, into partnership, where you behave the way you behave towards your partner out of love, not as a currency that you're going to cash in later on.
Exactly.
You can show up powerfully. You can show up aggressively as a man. You can be protective. You can be assertive in a loving way, not as a way to control, but just as just to be in your protective, aggressive nature. Some men have a more, say, artistic or a gentle nature, and you know, it's similar to the nice guy, except they're just being their nature. They're loving. They give love without expectation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that doesn't mean they get abused or manipulated, because they're not, their power struggle's done with them. They're not in a power struggle. And if they're not getting their needs met, they'll move on. They'll find somebody who genuinely wants to meet their needs from a safe place of having their needs met, where it's a partnership situation, rather than this nasty little tug of war that goes on with these transactions. You know, I gave up and I was nice or whatever. That is the hallmarks of a power struggle.
Yeah. I also want to talk about operating from woundedness.
Yeah.
So this is, I would say this is every single abuser out there. Every single person who abuses their power is probably operating from a space of woundedness. And I would love to bring up a personal example here of a young boy who was so beautiful and so sweet and innocent, full of love and generosity, curiosity, vibrancy. And at a young age, it became apparent that he was probably sexually molested. He started exhibiting symptoms of molestation, and we brought this attention to the mother, and the mother didn't do anything about it. And, you know, from my experience of understanding sexual abuse, sexual trauma, if that is not properly addressed and healed and integrated, more times than not, those who have been molested turn out becoming perpetrators. And I believe the rates for that are higher for men. I'm not exactly sure, but I believe the rates for that are higher than men, for men. And so, you know, I told this person, hey, it's a really good idea to get your child some help. And this is why. And never got him help. And he went through years of abuse, years, at least a decade or more. And what ended up happening was we found out that this young boy started perpetrating on other children. And now that this person is older, I see them really struggling to keep their life together. I see them hating themselves and hating their decisions and struggling to make good decisions for their life. And, you know, as someone who has been molested and raped by my biological father and someone in the church, it does a number on children. And I can look at this young boy and understand how sweet and innocent and beautiful he was, and still see that sweetness and that innocence in him, even though today he's not living in that sweetness and innocence. And this is the heart of every last person, is the sweetness, the innocence, the love, and the light. And it gets shrouded and covered in pain. And then when all that's been near to them is pain and suffering and abuse, that's exactly how they show up in the world. And so pausing to understand that many people are operating from this place of woundedness. Even myself, I received, I grew up in a very hectic household where screaming at the top of the lungs happened every day. And, consistently being torn down by my father, and the other abuse that I went through. And I just became this bottled up frenetic energy of anger and frustration, and it became explosive. And I ended up showing up in this world as one who abuses my own power, becoming a bully at school, physically and verbally abusing my siblings, among many other things. And so understanding again that these people are operating from woundedness. So how do we get to the wound? How do we go to the root of the problem instead of demonizing and shaming simply the outward behavior that's seen? Do either of you have anything you want to add to that?
No, that's a really good synopsis of what's going on. How do you get to the wound? That depends absolutely on the person. Some people are will not be reached. They will not choose, will not permit themselves to be reached. Others are desperately seeking a solution, but they're so lost, they're so confused, they just have no idea. They have no reference, no foundation to draw upon in order to find a balance. I think there's a tendency to write abusers off as being hopeless, but I really feel that that's misplaced, that so many times it's a reaction, whether it's physical or emotional or sexual abuse. So many times it is they're terrified. They're in an absolute state of fear. I mean, how can you say a grown adult who strikes a child is anything but terrified themselves? What are they afraid of? They're afraid of losing control even of a child.
Yeah, what is it in that child that they're afraid of? Literally. What do they see in that child that's triggering their own trauma? And what I really do believe is that for those who are abusers, who truly desire to heal and to shift, the key to them being able to move out of that pattern of abuse is healing their own from the inside, so that they can then release those triggers that come up that perpetuate that cycle of abuse. And anyone outside of like severe narcissistic spectrum, like the very extreme end of it, or sociopaths and psychopaths, that's a whole different story. You cannot, those people, you're not going to reach them. But anyone else absolutely has the power within themselves to heal and change those patterns in their lives, and that's sacred work.
And what we're doing here is we're looking into the abyss in a way, because we all have a shadow, and we all have an abusive side. We all have abused somebody in the past.
Michael, can you pause and for audience members who don't know what shadow means, would you explain that and then carry on?
Shadow is that part of us that we don't want to acknowledge exists. And we will go to great lengths to deny its existence, to fight it, to repress it, instead of just accepting that. I like to always say, and I know it's a little poetic maybe, but the moon has a shadow too. And look how beautiful it is, right? It's a part of our nature. And when we incorporate it, integrate it, it loses its power to create negative effects in our lives. It just is what it is. And I doubt there's anybody that can say they've never abused somebody. you know, in a moment just snapped at somebody, or they're having a really bad day or whatever. I mean, there's always a motivation behind it, always. And so those who go to abuse as their go-to, they're in a very sad spot. And
I'd like to add
go ahead, yeah.
something to that shadow. And so often our shadow originates from places that we have been taught shame around, that we've been taught are bad and wrong, like our sexuality. And so then we try to repress that, we try to separate ourselves from that, and then it breaks out in ways that are dysfunctional and cause hurt and harm, either to us or to other people or both. And then that just perpetuates that cycle of believing that that part of us is bad and wrong and evil. And so then we push it down even further, and that perpetuates even further that shadow idea that pieces of us are bad and wrong, when if we actually healed and integrated those parts, they become a beautiful part of the whole being. And then we can actually access the sacredness of those parts of ourselves just through that acceptance, complete acceptance and full integration of it.
That's huge. Shame is absolutely a part of that. We deny parts of ourselves that are natural parts of ourselves. Rage is completely natural and sometimes completely appropriate. And we've been socialized to the point where we don't believe that such a thing is ever permissible, right? But a mother defending her child? Yeah, absolutely. Or just a reaction to something that is absolutely unacceptable. Rage can be completely appropriate. Anger. Violence. There are times when it's appropriate to be violent. You know, if you're defending yourself or your children or your family from an immediate threat, you know, then that's, you know, when we take these things away from ourselves, we take away parts of our humanity, and we become less than human.
Yeah. On the less than human part, I want to touch really quick on the psychopath, sociopath spectrum, because Freya quickly touched on it. And I want to touch on it a little bit as well, because we also have the people out there who abuse their power, who are what we would consider psychopaths and sociopaths. So for a psychopath, from what I understand, the amygdala is kind of like lights out, and this is where our emotions are. So this is why there are some people who can find pleasure in pain, or who don't actually feel anything. Like when they are abusing people, they're not feeling, it's not registering. And so Frey, you touched on that briefly. When we're engaging with people like this, the only way to engage is to disengage. If the lights are out in the amygdala, where the emotions and the conscience are, then there's just no engaging. It's a losing battle. And so now I actually want to shift and talk about self-abuse, because this is another thing that I feel doesn't get enough attention. There's a lot of victimization going around. And yes, when we are abused and we aren't able to defend ourselves or fight against ourselves, that is being a victim. But then there's also taking these behaviors into adulthood and choosing into relationships where we will be abused. And I want to touch on that because for a lot of people who are in abusive relationships, it seems counterintuitive to say it's something that's being chosen into. And so I want to touch on this a little bit and give some background about a little bit about how trauma gets stored in the brain and how it affects us physiologically and psychologically. So when a painful or dangerous situation registers in the brain, it registers in the mammalian part of our brain where there isn't time or reason. And things are stored there based on sensory information, like your five senses, your intuition, also emotions that you may have felt. And the reason why is because this part of our brain is very primal and it's to protect us. So for example, if, you know, a bear comes after us, our brain doesn't want to think about how fast I need to run and work out that algebra equation. No, the brain just needs to understand that it has to fucking run for its life. And so this is where the mammalian brain kicks in. It's just like, oh my gosh, we've got to go. And so when a pain or trauma doesn't get resolved, all of that sensory information, all of the emotions, they get stored there, they get logged into the brain. And the reason why is because the next time a situation like this comes, the brain wants to know, okay, we have to do something about this. We have to run, we have to fight back. Now, another aspect of what our body does as well is attracting similar situations into our life to try to resolve them. So if the first trauma didn't get resolved, if you didn't end the trauma, the painful situation in a way that made you feel safe afterwards, your body is going to subconsciously look for that situation in life and attract similar situations into your life because it's seeking resolution. And I want to point this out because a lot of people look at their bodies as their own worst enemy. It's not your worst enemy. It's trying to seek a resolution, and it's looking for similar situations to try to solve that. And so tricking your body into solving that does work, and that's the work that Michael, Freya, and I do as well. But yeah, so we wanted to bring up this self-abuse of understanding what's going on in the brain. Why are we still being attracted to these situations? Why, if I want to change, does this situation keep coming in my life? And for me, I noticed this pattern in relationships, with romantic relationships, seeing how all the men in my life, historically, many of the men in my life, were not emotionally available. And I would say even abusive. And every time I would just like, my heart would be broken, and it got to the point of being paralyzed with fear and not being able to move forward. And my friend had a conversation with me, and she goes, Kelly, have you considered that maybe you're the one attracting this into your life? I was like, what? I don't want this. I'm not attracting it. And, you know, it turns out I was. It turns out I was. The common denominator was me. And so I found the roots to the pain. And this is where we can interrupt that process.
I want to add something to that. And so often the basis for this kind of pattern showing up and repeating in our lives is these traumas that we experience as very young children. And we come to a place where we've been programmed subconsciously to believe that we actually deserve that abuse. And we may know that that's bullshit up here in our minds, but if we don't actually shift that abuse on the that belief on the subconscious level, then we will continue to allow that and attract that back into our lives. Exactly. And one thing that's really powerful from the 4 agreements is that we're actually agreeing to that because we believe on the subconscious level we deserve that. And once the abuse goes beyond what we would abuse ourselves because we believe we deserve that, then we will leave that relationship. If it just goes a little beyond what we actually believe we deserve. And so once we actually shift that belief, we heal that wound that happened as a child that led to that belief that we deserve that on a subconscious level, then we will no longer allow that to keep repeating in our lives. And if we come up against that situation, it's like, fuck no, not doing this again, and walk away. And I also wanted to touch on another, you mentioned the fight, the flight, the freeze state. There's also another trauma response that we see in these kinds of relationships. It's called tend and befriend. It's a literal trauma response. Yeah. It's if I do everything right, if I do everything this person wants, then maybe they won't kill me. That's the body's response to that. And they get caught in that cycle of having to tend and befriend and make the abuser feel good so that then maybe they'll keep them and their children safe. And because of that combination of subconsciously not believing they deserve better and the fear of what will happen if they don't do everything this person wants, it creates this vicious cycle, and it ends up that everybody in the situation is harmed, their children and them. And it's because, and you know, the very real danger that over 80% of deaths of women, of homicides of women, are perpetuated by a partner, by a romantic partner. It's a very real danger. And so it's something, again, in the cycle of trauma in relationships that's in our society that's so prevalent that we must heal.
Yeah, Freya, we were talking about vibrational matches, and this kind of feels like that, the vibrational match. Do you want to lean into that a little bit?
Yes, and so for that situation, it's like so often you see this thing about the empath and the narcissist being a vibrational match. That's actually not true. It's the wounded empath that has not healed and the narcissist that are a vibrational match. So just like the energy of defensiveness and the energy of attack are a vibrational match for each other, and we're seeing this all over the internet right now. And this attack, defensiveness attack thing that's going on, it's the wounded empath who feels everything and takes that on and doesn't know how to set those personal boundaries in a healthy way, and that at that wounded level believes that they deserve the pain of everyone else that's being heaped upon them, and they're actually agreeing to it. So once they heal that, then that becomes very clear, and they no longer allow that. So being an empath and feeling deeply and being able to feel others' emotions and vibrations is not a curse. It's the wounding that's not healed. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It's going from being a victim to being self-empowered. It's going
Yes.
from being a victim to transmuting a circumstance to the benefit, you know?
Yes. And we can't actually help or heal anyone. All we can do is show them and guide them on that path.
Yes, and
to actually reclaiming those bits and pieces of healing themselves.
Yes, and one of the things I say to all my clients, I say it publicly: if anyone says they heal you, they're full of shit. We heal ourselves. We guide people to heal themselves. This is the game.
Yes. Yes. So really, anyone that you might be working with or seeing that is claiming claiming that victory on them and taking that on, saying I heal you, that kind of thing, hell no, run the other way.
They don't even know what's in you. They are not aware of the depth of what's in you. The only person that can heal you is you.
Yes. But having a really, really tapped in guide can empower you to do that healing and complete that healing in yourself. I mean, there's always more. We're never done the journey, but you can complete in 3 months the amount of progress that could take a lot of people 40 years, or maybe they never get there without that guidance. Does that make sense? Like why have to create the map all over again when someone else has got the map?
Exactly. Okay, so there's a couple more things. Oh, go ahead, Michael. You want to share something?
That's why a healer cannot heal you beyond the point that they have healed themselves. Because
amen, brother.
They can't guide
Yeah, all they're doing is guiding you to where they've already been. If they haven't been there, they can't guide you there. And so, I mean, we're all always healing, but you can't take somebody past the level that you haven't gone to yourself. And so that's the thing we try to clarify, because it's not, people will say, well, that means you have to be fully healed. You'll never be fully healed. You'll never be done with your own work. You'll always be doing your own work. But then you can turn around and help the person next to you over the obstacles that you just crossed. So you make it easier for them.
Absolutely. There's a couple more things I want to talk about under self-abuse. Freya, I want you to share your trauma hold on, but let's do that at the end. And then the last thing I want to discuss under self-abuse is addiction. So addiction shows up in a lot of different ways. It can be an eating disorder, so eating too much, or binging and purging, or not eating enough. There's porn addiction, there is drug addiction, inflicting pain. Some people want to inflict pain just to be able to feel things. There's promiscuity, which, Michael, I want you to lean into that as well. And then there's I mean, addiction can show up in any number of ways. And what it's showing, I believe, what we believe, is a dissociation, a lack of meaningful connection in life. And so in order to fill that deep void, we're stuffing anything and everything in it to just fucking feel something. Or maybe it's not to feel anything. Maybe the pain is too much and it's a way to simply dissociate. And for me, like promiscuity showed up for me, so did drug use, and I would even say drug abuse and alcohol abuse in my younger years. And for me, the chaos and the pain was just so fucking great in my life. I didn't want to feel it. And so starting probably 14 years old, I started smoking marijuana. And by the time I was 15, I was probably drunk and high most days of the week. And by the time I graduated my senior year of high school, I forgot. I didn't even keep track of how many boys I had slept with. I was looking to fill that void that I wasn't getting from my dad and from my house, that love that I needed, that acceptance that I wanted, and I was looking for it everywhere else except for inside. Michael, you want to lean into like
the whole promiscuity thing?
Yeah.
That's a tricky word, because it's a word that's been commandeered by those who would have us obey a set of rules, and if we don't, we're promiscuous. The way, huh?
It's a shame word.
A shame word, exactly. And so much judgment around it. And the way you're using it, the way we use it, is more along the lines of what is it driving you? You know, sexuality, I mean, none of us hold that sexuality is something to be shameful about. It's a part of being human. It's a lovely thing. It's a wonderful thing. It's a joyful thing. It's something to be shared. But if we're being driven to it, to get the drug hit, the endorphins, the forgetfulness, like you said, trying to fill a void that will never be filled. Mm-hmm. And that's, I mean, porn addiction's a lot the same way. You know, you get that, you get those endorphins going, and they distract you from the experience of being you. And so sex used that way is the same thing. And so I would never look at somebody, what they were doing, and make a judgment on them. That, you know, you're promiscuous. I would never say that, because I'd have to know what your motivator was. If you are doing it from a place of joyfulness and wanting to experience their body and humanity and this life and all of that, and you don't need it, you don't need a hit, you don't have to get these hits, and that's one thing. But if you need it like another hit on a you know, another drug hit, you need it like in order to get through the day. If you find yourself having difficulty existing without it, then you have to look at, there's a motivator here that's far deeper than the sexuality. And it can become a very dangerous and negative thing in your life. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it's all about the motivation, and it's all about going within and filling that void, finding a way to create your own love, your own sense of worth, your own ability to, you don't need a sexual partner. You don't need another hit from a porn video or whatever. If it happens to be in your space, or it happens to enrich your life, sex is a wonderful thing. It can enrich your life. If it's enriching your life, that's great. If that's not the case, then you need to go in and you get to find that void. And this is hard work. I'm not trivializing this. This is hard work. Because when you realize
the hardest work anyone will ever do, let's just clarify. This is the hardest work. The self-work is the hardest work.
You're overcoming so much socialization, so much trauma, so much stored trauma, so much shame. You have to overcome what you were told your entire childhood, that you were worthless, or that you came to believe about yourself.
Not so much overcoming. I'd like to jump in there on that, as it is releasing. Mm-hmm. It's a releasing of that, and then an embracing of the actual truth of who we are. It's a reclaiming, it's a reclamation, it's a remembering. So it's releasing what is not serving us, and is not to, and reclaiming the wholeness and the beauty and the grace, and it's an incredible experience. And yes, it's the most intense and vulnerable work that you will ever do, and it's also the most rewarding and safest and most unconditionally loved that you can ever feel. It's incredibly beautiful. And I wanted to also speak to something that Kelly was talking about with the sexual hyperactivity being a trauma, like one end of the trauma spectrum. Like we have the numbness and the lack of sexual desire, and then we have the hyper desire and promiscuity that can also be a trauma response. And if someone's engaging in that from that place of their woundedness and literally using that activity to reconfirm and reinforce the belief that they are bad and wrong and shameful, and that sexuality is a bad thing, that is a self-perpetuating, very, very self-harming practice.
Yeah, this is all artificially generated. We are in a universe that's surrounded by love, is love. We are love. Everybody around us is love, and yet we lack love. What's going on? There's an artificial situation that is within us when we don't have love, when we can't access it, that is artificially created. It needs to be removed. It needs to be taken out. It's an alien artifact and within us, so to speak.
And I want to bring it home again as to why that alien belief system is in us. Maybe not in us. I don't want to speak. I don't want to own it necessarily right now. But how could something like that exist in a person? And it goes back to people choosing because they feel that they deserve it on a subconscious level. Why do they feel they deserve it on a subconscious level? And it goes back to being treated a certain way. We can look at animals and we understand this from animals, and yet with ourselves, we can be so fucking mean and cruel. So we can look at an abused dog and we can understand that, if any hand or object comes at that dog, it's like, is just like fucking freaking out about everything because it's a flinch. It's a reaction. It's a flinch to something that has happened many times. If a hand is raised to strike you several times, oh, the next time you flinch. And this is how a lot of people are walking around in life. They're walking around with these flinches.
A trigger.
A trigger, we call them triggers as well. And it's from years of being treated like this. Now we can look at, you know, 2 other dogs that have never been abused, and like say like one dog falls on top of the other dog. The dog that was fallen onto, it will hurt, and maybe he'll turn around and like, you know, yelp and maybe nip at the dog. But once he realizes it wasn't intentional, he releases it. He lets it go. And when we have not released the feeling of this world being dangerous, of a world not being safe, of a world where we don't feel loved and accepted and cherished and whole, that is exactly what is carried into the world. And that is exactly the treatment that we give ourselves and that we accept from other people. This is why it is paramount to do the work on yourself.
Yeah, and we can see this when we see a
it's
child that has
work.
not, when we see a child that has not been socialized yet, you know, when they're in their natural state and they're so joyful, they're so excited for the world, they're curious, they're full of love, they give love freely, they accept it freely. Okay, that's our original state. That's how we came into this world. So it's everything that happened from that point until now that is added baggage to who we are. Freya has to leave.
Yeah,
okay.
Freya's leaving us right now.
But it's added baggage to how we're showing up in the world and who we are in the moment. But it isn't really who we are. We are still that child, that joyful child that is so excited to be on this planet and wants to own it all.
Molly has a thought right here that's really provoking, and I want to bring it up. She says, for myself, I recognize that it's not something I deserve, but it's something that I was told over and over that was quote unquote love. So it's what I have embraced as love for so long. And yes, that's true too. That's accepting what you think you're worth. So if somebody tells you this is love and this is what you're worth, this is the love that you're worth, that's the behavior that is accepted. And that's why for so many years, I accepted emotionally unavailable men who continued to talk down to me and talk to me like I'm stupid, because that's exactly how my father talked to me.
And when we get to the point where intellectually we say, oh, I deserve better. That's great, but intellectually doesn't hack it. That's not where the real action's going on. It's the body that still believes that does deserve that. That's where so many of our decisions are made. That's where our reactions, that's where our triggers all lie.
Yeah. And Molly's bringing up another thing where she said she didn't even know that other love existed. And Molly, I am feeling that. And this is also something that is very common for people who have gone through abuse. They really don't know how to feel love or even a lot of emotions, let alone express them or show them on their face. This is something that I had to retrain myself to feel and to be able to express. And I feel like we're probably going to be talking more about this in future lives. I want to move on to social abuse. So we've talked about how fear is used to control and manipulate. Freya was going to share on this, and she had to leave early. So I'm going to share on this because we come from sort of similar backgrounds, both very extremely religious. Freya's from a Mormon fundamentalist background, and I'm from a conservative Christian background. And some of the ways that fear was used to control me was fear of my sexuality, being told that my sexuality was dirty and dangerous, while simultaneously being molested by a Sunday school teacher and raped by, you know, my biological dad. So talk about fucked up messages coming to me. It's like, oh, hey, it's dirty. And, oh, by the way, it happened to you. Oh, and let's just sweep it under a rug because it's uncomfortable for everybody. And we'll just like let this little kid deal with it on her own. And so fear of being shamed, fear of my sexual nature being evil, those were definitely things that were used to control me. And this is something that happens a lot in society. Fear of the unknown or fear of a what if consequence is given, and then all of a sudden people are like afraid to act out of sovereignty and afraid to act out of a place that actually cares for themselves. And Michael, you come from the Mormon fundamentalist background too. Maybe not as fundamental as Freya, but you were still very conservative Mormon.
Yeah, I wasn't in the polygamous branch like she was, but very similar beliefs for sure. We read the same scriptures, and yeah, there's of course there's always the sword hanging over us of if we don't do everything perfectly right, that when we die we're gonna an eternity of misery, which is a hell of a thing to believe.
Hell of a motivating factor.
Yeah, but shame for sure. Shame about everything that it is to be a human. It seemed like appetites, sexual appetites were shamed. The normal desires that a growing boy will have, shamed. You know, even to the point where we were ashamed about the music we listened to, what we drank, you know, the soda pop that we drank, the books we read, the plays that we went to, the movies we watched, everything was constrained and shamed. And it's how you control somebody. You fill them with so much shame and keep them so off balance, never knowing what really the right thing to do is.
Yeah.
And you keep telling them that it's really very simple, but it never is. You know, and just there's so many rules and so many restrictions and so many ways that you can fuck it all up for eternity, that you're in a constant state of fear and you're totally off balance. And they're easy to control in that state. And it isn't just religions that do that. Societies do that, governments do that. They will keep you off balance. If everything's against the law, then you're always a lawbreaker. So having so many laws that you can't possibly ever know them all is a wonderful way to keep people off balance all the time. I don't want to get too far into that, but
I do want to touch on that fear aspect a little bit, like what happens internally when we're living in a constant state of fear. Do you want to touch on that, or do you want me to touch on that?
Yeah, fear is natural when there's a direct threat to your life or your health or your family. I mean, direct threat. If you don't act now, you know, you better be fearing. You better. Fear gets you motivated, gets your adrenaline going, it gets you running, it gets you fighting, it gets you, gets you reacting in ways that can perpetuate and continue your life and your tribe and your family. When we're constantly in a state of fear, all those chemicals are still running as if we needed to fight or flight, as if we had a tiger chasing us. They're all going all the time, huh?
Or freeze, depending on what your central nervous system response is.
Yeah. And so all those chemicals are constantly running. They're not good for you. They mess up your organs. They shut down your higher reasoning ability. And so you're not able to, I don't care what people say, when they are in a state of fear, they're not critically thinking. They're too busy being afraid.
I actually want to talk about what happens internally when the trauma response is triggered. So the brain sends out chemicals, norepinephrine, cortisol, things like that, to either activate us for fight or flight, or bring us into freeze mode. And so there's so many internal things that happen when this is triggered. Number one, energy is pulled from your digestive tract, okay? So when you're living in a constant state of fear and that trauma response is triggered, you're pulling energy from your digestive tract, from your reproductive organs, from your immune system, and from your neocortex, which Michael talked about. This is where your higher thinking skills are. So imagine if you're getting energy pulled from your digestive tract, immunity, reproductive organs, and brain. What kind of havoc is that going to wreak on somebody's life? It wreaks a lot of fucking havoc. And the ability to think and rationalize and make good decisions for yourself goes out the window. And we're seeing it now with a lot of people living in a state of fear and not being able to think rationally and interact with each other in a kind way and make decisions that actually care for themselves.
Now, we've talked about abuse and we've talked about fear, but the title of this is about shame. So I definitely want to hit on that a little more. We just barely touched on that. And absolutely, shame is an externally imposed form of control. Okay, it's a handle. It's how people control you. And boy, I'll tell you, when we talk about being shameless, people kind of lose it sometimes. They're like, oh, shameless people are terrible. Well, why do you say that? Well, they'll do anything. No, they won't. They still have values. They still have integrity, and they have guilt to serve them when they step outside their integrity. What's the purpose of shame? Shame is saying, this is a set of values. These are our values. This is society's decided this is a value, and we're going to impose it on you. And if you don't, we're going to attack you and attempt to shame you. Well, you have to accept the shame for it to work. You have to internalize the handle in order for it to be effective. So for instance, if I let go of the idea that my sexuality is something to be ashamed about, somebody comes along and tells me that I should behave in a particular way. It doesn't touch me if I've rejected it. I just look at them and, okay, that's what you believe, but it doesn't work for me. And this really pisses people off. You know, we've had people in some of our writings where we talked about shame. We've had people that have told Freya that she should be burnt at the stake because she claimed to have no shame because she didn't accept the shaming of others. Where shame gets really insidious is when we internalize it. When we start abusing ourselves, again, we're talking about self-abuse here. When we say, my desire for sexuality is shameful, my natural human desire that was built into me when I was born, that's tied to being a human being, that is bad and sick and wrong, okay? And we accept that and we internalize it, and then we're attacking ourselves. Every time we have these desires, every time we have these urges that are natural, we attack ourselves. We're at literal war with ourselves because of shame. And this is what we mean when we say releasing shame is your superpower, because you stop the war within yourself. You stop it in its tracks, this particular type of war. And you remove the ability of others to control you.
Yes.
Through your own internal dialogue, through your fears, through your fear of acceptance, through your fear that you're not good enough. All these things that shame attaches itself to within you. Shame really has very little usefulness. Maybe I would say none.
I would say none too.
Yeah, it's like guilt corrupted. Because guilt is useful. You're like, oh, damn, that is so far outside my values, and I did that. I get to, you know, your guilt is going to drive you to say, what can I do better? Well, how can I not ever behave in that way again? What was my motivator for that? It drives you to seek solutions and to restore integrity. Shame just beats up. It beats you up. It gives other people the ability to beat you up. It's worthless.
It is worthless. And I want to encourage people, if you are experiencing shame in any part of your life, try staying curious with that shame. Dig a little bit deeper, make friends with it. I use my emotions and feelings often to find my way to root issues. So I'll I'll give you an example of that. So I talked about being raised religious and believing a lot of what I was taught about sexuality and taking on that shame. And I remember discovering self-pleasuring. Here we go, internet world. I discovered self-pleasuring about 2.5 years ago. Yes, I lived in 37.5 years of fucking shame and not nurturing my body. And I remember having an orgasm one day, and it was amazing. And I decided to do it again. I was having like a really stressful day one day, and for some reason I had decided to look up my child. I don't want to say I decided to look up the man who molested me as a child and see what he was up to in this world. And it turns out he was adopting kids, at-risk youth. And so of course I was like just stressed and triggered and like, how can this guy be adopting kids and da, 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 da. And like I go upstairs, and by this time I had done a lot more self-pleasuring, and by a lot more I say like maybe a week of practice. And I go in the shower and I'm getting ready to do the self-pleasuring, and all of a sudden all this shame starts coming all over me, and it's like, you're dirty, you're this, you're that, and da da da. And I'm listening to all this, and I'm in tears. And through my tears, I self-pleasured. I said, this is my body, this is my pleasure. And the orgasm I had afterwards was so deeply healing and moving. And it was in that moment that I realized I had been carrying somebody else's shame. Somebody had lied to me about my sexuality and told me it was dirty, and it wasn't. Something was done to me that was fucking dirty. And I took on that person's shame. And so I rejected that. I sent that back to the universe, and I took ownership of my body, and I took ownership of my pleasure.
Beautiful. Wow.
Yeah, so I share that story because I want people to stay curious with their shame. Where is that story coming from? Where did you first hear it? Did it originate in you, or did it originate from somebody else? Did it originate from a story? And then there's just a few more things we want to talk about because it's been a while. I think we've gone over an hour. As far as the ways that social abuse come up. So this is going to tie back into shame too. And Michael, you've shared a lot about these topics in your group. Transforming
trauma. Yeah.
Transforming trauma.
Yeah.
It used to be a longer title.
It has a full title, yeah.
So there's gaslighting. That's a social tactic that's being used to bring shame on people. There's also isolation, and there is triangulation. Michael, do you want to touch on any of those, all of those?
Triangulation is when you enroll others to make that person wrong. Okay, they make the victim wrong. So you get, like in a relationship, you'll get their friends and you'll convince them that you're the good guy and that they're crazy or they're having problems or whatever. And it's a way of enrolling others to get you to doubt yourself and to think you're crazy and to think, you know, your abuser was right all along. Isolation is isolating you from any forms of support, anybody who might agree with you. Okay. And
in isolation, I want to clarify really quick. Isolation is not just physical. It can be social isolation. Mm-hmm. Feeling so like somebody so degrading you that you feel completely alone and unable to like connect and reach out to anybody because how could you? You're not going to relate.
Yeah. Yeah. Be in a room full of people and feel alone. Yeah. And the whole gaslighting thing, that can be done in a lot of ways, continually lying and then telling you that you're wrong, that they were lying. You know,
Oh
telling
yeah,
you
we're
you're
not
crazy.
experiencing any of that right now.
Yeah, does all sound familiar, right? Uh, and the thing about it is when we get an abusive situation, and this is true societally or socially or relationship wise, is we get in a place where we think we have to figure it out. And we get so in our head, you know, we're going to figure this person out, why they're doing this, and we're going to understand it. We're going to understand it, and we're going to conquer it intellectually. And it's a way of just locking you into the abusive situation, because they'll never give you the clarity. They're constantly changing the rules. They're constantly changing the dialogue. They're telling you they never said that, and even if they did say it, you shouldn't have shared it anyway, and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's just crazy making stuff that goes on. And but your intellect is still trying to work this out. There's got to be an answer. There's got to be. No, there doesn't. And when you stop seeking understanding beyond the fact that you're being abused, just accept that. You accept that you could be wrong about things. You don't have to be right about everything. You can accept that that the abuse exists, and that you're not going to get clarity. You're not going to get closure. Closure is a nasty one. You know, relationships, especially, we seek closure, and closure we held out in front of us like a carrot on a stick for a really long time to keep us locked into that situation. Socially, the same thing. All we have to do is realize that there's abuse going on, and then just let it go, release it, walk away from it, let go of all the little ways that we can keep getting sucked in as we try to figure it out. We don't have to figure it out. We may never figure it out. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, you're right. It doesn't matter, Michael. It doesn't matter. When there is abuse taking place, the only thing that matters is creating safety.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And
you're the only judge of that.
Exactly. You're the only judge of that. And that's oftentimes what feels so sinister about abuse. I remember even as a child, when I would have my moments of bravery and call my dad out, I would be met with words like, "You don't deserve anything. You have a roof over your head and food on your back, and that's all you get." That's how I was raised, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what I started to believe. And that is what is so sinister about abuse, is there is truth laced in there with lies, just so many lies.
And omissions, and things that are obscure and always will be obscure, and you'll never discover what they were. And when you finally just let go of that, making it as something that just doesn't matter, you can move on without it.
And the thing about abuse is, you know, there's probably going to be wrong making on both sides. And in the end, it really doesn't even matter. If it's abusive, create safety for yourself.
Yeah.
Period. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and beginning the discussion on something that doesn't get enough coverage. And we are so excited to be continuing this series. Next week, we are going to be discussing how the war within is reflected in the wars outside of us. Or another way to say it, if there's chaos in your life, there's probably chaos inside. And so next week, we're going to dive more into that now that we have given you a great idea of how abuse shows up in its many forms. Now we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of how abuse can affect us, how to release our shame around abuse, and how to step into self-empowerment and self-healing. So any closing words, Michael?
Doing great.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Join us next week. Oh, wait, let me see if there's any other questions. The videos, okay, Molly asked where these videos are going to be posted. So they're going to be on our public pages, and we're also going to be posting them in our respective groups. I'm Kelly Love with Kelly Love Rewilding. Should have said that at the beginning, whatever.
Put it in the comments. And I'll put my group in the comments as well.
Exactly. So thank you all for joining. We'll see you next week, 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, Tuesday.